Pretty much anyone who's at all familiar with medieval Christianity knows that the Pope was the central figure in Western European Christianity. The question then becomes, how did the Pope become the Pope? The bishops of Rome, who we see in antiquity, clearly didn't have the kind of authority that we associate with medieval and later popes, so how did that process happen? This video is more or less the study of what happened in the West to create the papacy. Let's first take a lay of the land and figure out the ways in which the Western Church differed from the Eastern Church on a cultural level. So, in the East, we saw that there were a lot of aristocrats, but they also had to know how to debate. In the West, that was a lot less important. Aristocrats who joined the church and became leaders could reasonably expect to be obeyed and not really have to prove their worth in theological debates. Communities in the West tended to be a great deal smaller than in the East. This is because, one, the West was less populated, but also, two, Christianity spread a lot slower in the Western Empire than it did in the East. Now, because the Gospels and New Testament were written in Greek, and for other reasons such as the differences between Greek and Roman philosophy that we've discussed in the past, there were fewer theological disputes out west. There were fewer questions of Christ's nature or the relationship between the elements of the Trinity. People just kind of took these things for granted, more or less. And they really weren't all that interested in what was going on in the East. They didn't really care about Arius too much. Cities, just like in the East, had martyr cults, and the majority of the martyr cults in the West were centered heavily around victims of Decius and Diocletian. Because the Western churches started, or at least came into prominence much later, they couldn't really draw on early martyrs. Remember, the first official persecution under Trajan was in Bithynia. Around that same period, there probably wouldn't have been enough Christians in a Western city to inspire the ire of the local pagan authorities who were worried about the sanctity of their own cults. And unlike in the East, where they spoke Greek and they also worshipped in Greek and debated in Greek, in the western half of the empire, people spoke, wrote, and did what little debating they did in Latin. So this meant that they lived in a almost completely separate sphere, intellectually speaking. So who were the early intellectuals of the West before we get to the beginning of the Middle Ages? Well, I guess the West can take credit for Irenaeus of Lyon. He's technically a Greek, but he did serve as bishop in Lyon, which is in Gaul, modern France. So we can do that. Again, to review his credentials, he wrote against heresies, and he used the argument of apostolic succession to try to discredit the Gnostics. He pointed out that he can trace his own authority to the Apostle John through his successor Polycarp. So this is something that becomes very important in the West as well as in the East, but in particular for the bishops of Rome, since they will ultimately find that they can trace themselves to the most important of the disciples, and it's an argument that they'll have to make and win against a lot of other competitors. Another great Western intellectual was Tertullian of Carthage. He is of Berber origin. Berbers are kind of like Arabs, I guess, culturally, except they tended to live in North Africa rather than in the Middle East proper. He dies around the year 240. He is the guy pictured on the left, and his main sort of contribution is that he comes up with something like a proto-trinity. It's not quite fully developed, and because he really broke some ground in that area, a lot of his teachings later were ruled non-canon once the church really started to get into the kind of minutia we talked about in the last video. I mean, not everybody's lucky enough to survive the debates that happen centuries after they die, and Tertullian was one of the guys who kind of fell off the wayside a little bit. Another Western intellectual was Cyprian of Carthage. Carthage was probably the best intellectual center of the West in terms of Christian theology. He was actually executed in the year 258, which made him a martyr. And he fought against some early heresy, probably the Donatists, which was a group of heretics in the West who aren't really all that interesting. He also wrote about a plague in the 3rd century, which is why the plague of that period is called the Cyprian Plague, even though it's basically the same as the Antonine Plague that broke out under Marcus Aurelius. And as I said, he was martyred, and that always helps you get remembered by the church. So if you want to get remembered, make sure you're martyred. Lesson number 1. In the last video, I talked about monks in the East and how they tended to be independent of the authority of the bishops. In the West, the exact opposite was the case. Monks tended to be very much led by aristocrats. Aristocrats, some of them would become monks themselves, found monasteries, and their authority was rarely challenged. Pretty much the status that you were born into was something that you kept when you entered the church. So these monks tended to be much more orderly. They tended to live out on large estates. They didn't really live near cities or get involved in city life too much. They weren't really politically active. They weren't theologically active because, again, the West doesn't really do theology in the way that the East does. And because of this, they are not prone to mob violence. There aren't very many, or actually I don't know of any cases of Western monks say, running into a city and killing a pagan professor like Hypatia, for instance. So this is a very different monastic culture, and there also are no stylites, to the best of my knowledge, although there may have been 1 or 2 stylites who tried their craft in the West, but I don't think it really became a thing there. During our period of focus from 300 onwards, there were a number of major leaders of the Western Church, the first of which is Ambrose of Milan. He is called Ambrose of Milan because he was the bishop of Milan from 374 to 397. Now, the thing about Milan that was significant is that it was the Western imperial capital once the empire was divided into East and West. It was a big city near the frontier, and because of its location and because now so many emperors were Christian, Ambrose was able to exert influence politically, and he did that very well. He doesn't really lay out a set ideology, or he's not really associated with a famous text the way a lot of the great thinkers of the East are, but his life and actions really try to establish the idea that there's a church authority which is independent of the state, and that the church draws its authority from a separate source than the state. And what I mean by that is that we see that he was able to effectively use public pressure and the threat of excommunication to prevent the restoration of a victory statue in the Senate House at Rome at one point. And in the aftermath of Theodosius' victory over his last opponent, Eugenius, he was able to force Theodosius to perform penance in order to take communion after Theodosius allowed a massacre of the defeated soldiers on the other side. So by doing this, Ambrose established that there are church officials who have their own realm of authority, which is separate from that of emperors, and that these church authorities can use that authority that they have spiritually to punish or correct a secular figure, even one as high as the emperor. Now, what's interesting about this is that Theodosius is also vital in setting that precedent of the emperor as the head of the church. However, his actions in that regard were all taken in the East, whereas he performed penance in Milan, and the people there took a different lesson than the people who he was interacting with in Constantinople. So, same guy, but different lessons and different precedents. Intellectually speaking, arguably the greatest of the Western bishops was Jerome. He was actually born in Illyria, that kind of mountainous area that separates Italy from the Balkans, and had been thought of as barbarous for a long time. And unlike a lot of Western church authorities, he actually was very attached to classical literature and learning. In the East, you can almost take it for granted that most of the major bishops we've talked about were very learned men who studied Greek philosophy and other Christian theologians pretty carefully, knew their classics inside and out. In the West, that was not always a given, but Jerome was a very erudite individual. Now, he is, I guess, maybe the closest thing that the West had to an Origen of Alexandria. And some of his concerns are how to live a Christian life in a large city like Rome. He thought that maybe the Bible was a little more geared towards life in a rural area like Judea. So he talked about how to adapt the teachings of the Bible to living in a large city like Rome with all of its various temptations. And one of his special interests is how women should conduct themselves. And you probably won't be too surprised to learn that his ideas on how women should conduct themselves are that women should be silent and obedient. Probably didn't see that coming, did you? Yeah, very original. His most famous work is that he is the official translator of what is known as the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the Old and New Testament. So that is the official Bible of the Catholic Church even to this day. Obviously, as I said, the West spoke Latin, and they also wrote and read Latin. So when Jerome made this edition of the Bible, it became sort of their new go-to. And obviously that's had a major lasting impact. Now, he also achieved sainthood in the Catholic Church, not shocking. The Eastern Orthodox Church may be a little more surprising since the Eastern and Western churches did have some squabbles over which language was more appropriate for the church. And he also received sainthood in the Anglican Communion. So, not too bad, I guess, especially since the Anglican Communion didn't start till many centuries after his death. Without question, the greatest intellectual of the Western Church in terms of his influence was Augustine of Hippo. He lived from 354 to 430, and he served as the bishop of Hippo Regius, a city in North Africa, from 395 to 430. He had a varied and interesting life. He was a teacher of rhetoric. He was a Manichee when he was in his 20s. His mother was a Christian when he was a child. But ultimately, he settled on Christianity by the time he was around 31 or 32 years old, and he was baptized by Jerome, who we just talked about. Augustine wrote two very famous works which are still widely read. One is the Confessions, where he talks about his various failures in life and his moral vicissitudes. Books 3 and 4 talk about his time as a Manichee and the time where he had a mistress. There's also a part of the book where he talks about having a son out of wedlock and some other fun stuff. And he also wrote a work called The City of God Against the Pagans, which is considered to be his magnum opus. And this work, among other things, lays out the case that the church really needs to set itself apart from the state, since the state is something which is not immortal. He had the benefit of writing The City of God after the sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 CE. So that means that he could kind of see that the Western Roman Empire might not survive, and that the church, however, if it did teach universal truth, would need to be able to survive the death of a political institution. Now, Augustine is the most important figure in Catholic thought until the 12th century, when he's displaced by Thomas Aquinas. But even today, it would be hard to, say, go to some sort of Catholic theological debate and not have to reckon with Augustine on some level. So, he is one of the most important figures in this period. And in a previous class, I talked about the Vandal invasion of North Africa. Well, Augustine actually died during the siege of Hippo Regius, as still bishop, now an old man, and he died before the Vandals took the city. So, Fun fact that sort of connects us back to the barbarian invasions of the 5th century. Let me take just a moment to apologize for the loud humming sound in this video. My refrigerator has been running very loudly, and my computer was running loudly as I was processing the other lecture on the Eastern Church, so sorry about that. Hopefully this won't be too big of an impediment. Now let's keep going though. Rome as a symbol. So the thing about Rome is that a lot of its political power and even its economic and social power had faded quite a bit by the 5th century. But it still held a symbolic power that no other city in the empire, even Jerusalem, could hope to rival. By the 4th century, Rome was still very populous. It had probably declined somewhat from its peak, but, it was still a pretty damn big city. Probably had about 1 million people. Unlike a lot of other cities where bishops were becoming increasingly important figures in their city, Rome was still dominated by the old senatorial elite, and these guys were still overwhelmingly pagan. Because of the pagan dominance in Rome, these bishops of Rome did not actually assert themselves in city affairs until after the year 400. And a lot of people think that this was only enabled by the fact that the Roman senators had heavily backed the failed usurper Eugenius, and then he had been defeated by Theodosius. And that, of course, emboldened the Christian leaders in Rome to assert themselves against these now embarrassed pagan senators. So, basically, despite the fact that Rome would later house the popes, the truth is that the bishops of Rome played second fiddle to the pagan elite in city affairs well into the 5th century. And that's a lot of why a lot of the earliest bishops of Rome were not very important or remembered for anything in particular. In my previous lecture, I talked about how Ignatius of Antioch had advocated for a church structure in each city whereby you had a bishop at the top and then you had presbyters and deacons below him to assist him. A lot of times that assistance involved having the presbyters preside over different local branches of the church in different areas of the city. We also see this happening in Alexandria when we have Arius as a presbyter there, and he was responsible for preaching in one of the neighborhoods of Alexandria. And later, of course, he caused the Arian controversy. In Rome, the lack of a strong personal leader in the form of really influential or charismatic bishops of Rome really helped to foster the growth of the institutional authority of the Curia. The Curia just being this council of the bishop, his presbyters, and his deacons when they would meet and discuss things. Each region in the city of Rome had its own church. Each one of these churches would be under the jurisdiction of a presbyter or a deacon or a priest. And these guys would then meet together in the Curia, and the bishop would preside, and they would discuss things of importance to the city church. And ultimately, they would probably consult with the Curia, the Bishop of Rome would, before he would attend, say, the Council of Nicaea, or some of the other councils that the bishops of Rome were known to attend. Now, the church in Rome significantly was not divided by theological issues. There were probably no meetings of the Curia which were anywhere nearly as intense as the meeting of the Curia in Alexandria, when we have, the Bishop of Alexandria named Alexander squaring off against Arius. So nothing quite that dramatic or interesting happened in Rome so far as we know. In my last lecture on the Eastern Church, I mentioned that there was a guy named Ignatius of Antioch who taught that the thing that gave Christian bishops their authority was their apostolic succession, which goes back to the men who directly followed Jesus. Well, the Roman Church needed a way to distinguish itself. It hadn't been producing the great men of this era. Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine, none of them were in Rome itself. They were all from different places. So how does Rome then compete with that? How does Rome rise to the top? They don't have an emperor anymore. The Western Empire will end, and obviously the Western imperial centers, as we've already discussed, were more in Milan and Ravenna than Rome during this late imperial period. So what Rome does is it takes up this idea of apostolic succession and it makes it work for them. So the Roman Church had long claimed that both Peter and Paul were martyred at Rome. Peter, of course, was the leader of the disciples in the Bible, and Paul was one of the first converts and the guy who was the major intellectual leader in the very early first century, the guy who wrote a lot of letters to various Christian communities which were preserved in the New Testament. So these are the two most important biblical figures after Jesus, and if both of them died in Rome, then that should make Rome pretty important. And both of these guys had sites in Rome, especially Peter, who was a little more important symbolically, and this led to the formation of the Petrine Doctrine. So not only did bishops derive their authority from their connection to the apostles, but they derived their authority in proportion to the importance of the disciple to which they could draw a lineage. So if you're the Bishop of Rome, you inherit your authority from Peter rather than from, say, John or one of the other, in this case, lesser apostles. Let's rewind just a bit to the last lecture again, where we had the Council of Chalcedon in 381 with Theodosius I presiding. The main issue was about Arianism, but there were a few other issues at stake, as there always were, and one of those was the relative prestige of each city's church. Now, in this debate, Rome emerged victorious and was given the position of the most prestigious church, but not the most authoritative. There was no decision made at that council about which city would have the most authority. So, why do you think that might be? Well, if you think about it from the perspective of Antioch or Alexandria, their number one goal is not to allow the other city to take the number one spot. If you let Rome have it, that doesn't seem like much of a threat. So you would want a neutral third party to take precedence rather than your main rival, obviously. So that's all good. If you're Constantinople, Rome is the other capital of the empire, and if it really declines and decays, then you could argue that symbolically Constantinople is the successor to Rome, therefore it might inherit the Petrine prestige. So maybe that's about what they were thinking when they allowed this to happen. But certainly they weren't doing it out of the goodness of their hearts or because they really thought that Rome deserved this distinction. Let's be clear on that. This was a purely political process. Now, Leo I comes along and he becomes Bishop of Rome in about the year 440, and he continues as Bishop of Rome until 461. And he really pushes the Petrine Doctrine and develops it fully into what the modern Petrine Doctrine basically is. And what he does is he draws very heavily on the principles of Roman law and the idea of an unbroken episcopal succession. So the argument is that when a bishop is elected in Rome, that bishop becomes Peter. So it's not just that he inherits the teachings of Peter, he becomes Peter in a legal sense. In Roman law, when you inherited an estate from your father, you basically became your father. That's one of the weird little nuances of Roman law, and Leo decided to apply that to ecclesiastical affairs. So this was his official argument. And as such, since Peter was the primary heir of Jesus and the leader of the apostles, Leo therefore says that Rome and its bishop would have the final say on all matters of doctrine and all disputes over who gets to hold what offices. So if a city couldn't decide who was going to be the next bishop, in theory they would have to defer to Leo or the current Bishop of Rome and then get their appointment that way. And I think more or less it's kind of safe to say that Leo I is also known as Leo the Great, is the first actual pope. I can't really see much of a case for giving this title to any previous bishop of Rome, but I think Leo is authoritative enough that you can call him pope if you like. Armed with the Petrine Doctrine, both in its fully developed form under Leo I and in its proto-forms under earlier bishops, the bishops of Rome would try to intervene in various theological disputes, and they would claim the right to act as arbitrators on the grounds that as Peter's heirs they had a special authority and a sort of special knowledge even that others simply did not share. The reality is that during a lot of these complex proceedings at a lot of the church councils, especially the ones talking about Arius and Nestorius and Monophysitism. You know what I mean. It's been a long day. I've been doing all these lectures back to back to back. Bear with me. You know what I mean. Okay. The actual truth here, as far as I can tell, is that the bishops of Rome didn't really care about the theology too much. What they did care about was establishing the authority of their see over that of the others. So what they would do is play power broker between Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople, and use their vote as a bargaining tool in order to get their prestige and authority confirmed. If other churches, to gain a temporary leg up, were willing to acknowledge Rome's authority and set a precedent where Rome got to play arbitrator, then this is in Rome's strategic long-term interest as a political player in the church. So this is basically what Rome does, and it does this game very well, especially Leo I and his successors. And this is how the bishops of Rome become the Pope, more or less. This is how they gain that level of authority, is through practice. And then later they can point out, well, your predecessors acknowledged the authority of my predecessor, and he acknowledged what I said about, being Peter's heir and literally being Peter. So I don't know why you're rejecting it. Do you reject all of Christ's teachings? So that's the kind of thing they could do in order to advance their own authority vis-a-vis the other bishops. I've already alluded to this in this video, and I talked about it at greater length in my previous video, but keep in mind that this great conflict between Alexandria and Antioch, and how they always were at odds at every church council, played right into Rome's hands. Rome was able to step in and help resolve these disputes and advance its own interest in the process. So I won't go over this too much, so if you're interested in reading what I have written here, you can just pause the video and read it at your own leisure. There's nothing new here really, but if you need a review, here it is. In pursuit of making the Petrine Doctrine their claim to supremacy in the Christian world, the bishops of Rome, or popes if you prefer to call them that, intervened in Eastern controversies, most of which didn't really concern them too much, such as the controversy over Origen's writings, the dispute over John Chrysostom being deposed as the Patriarch of Constantinople, the dispute over Nestorianism, and the dispute over Monophysite stuff. Let's just go with that. I said it earlier. I don't know what the problem is now. I don't know. Anyway, this whole process suffered a pretty big setback at Chalcedon in 451, when one of the 30 things that were agreed to by the people assembled there was that the new Rome, that is to say Constantinople, was to enjoy equal prestige to the old Rome because the imperial capital had been removed from Rome to Constantinople. Therefore, the prestige had been copied and pasted, if you will. So now the Pope had to reestablish his authority, and that was a pretty big setback. So ultimately what we see is that, as we discussed at the end of the last video, the real head of the Eastern Church would be the emperor at Constantinople, whereas when the Western Empire goes its own way and splinters, its spiritual head will be the Pope in Rome. Now, through various papal interventions over time, Rome does successfully establish the idea of Rome as the final source of authority, and this is something that is very much accepted in the West, although in the East, because the emperor doesn't quite always agree with Rome's authority, this is not quite as accepted. And again, because of the findings of the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the patriarchs of Constantinople are also not too happy about the idea of being subordinate to the bishops of Rome. About the term pope, it actually was something which started in the East, believe it or not, and someone tried to get this started for the title of the Bishop of Alexandria as early as the 3rd century, but the Roman Church picked it up and made it their official designation only in the 11th century. So, if you ever hear someone referred to as Pope or Bishop of Rome, it's the same thing, just to recapitulate that. And many of the really early bishops of Rome who are called Pope are only called so in retrospect, and they were never called that in their own lifetimes. That concludes this week's lectures. Next week we'll move on to a whole different topic, and I promise there will be 100% less theology and less stuff of that nature.